ingredients as you would use if you were making beer at home, all right? The first two stages of making whiskey are the same as making beer. So the first thing that happens to the grain after it's harvested, if it's going to be made into whiskey, is they malt the grain. And that's where the name single malt whiskey comes from, the malting of the grain. And how they malt it, the grain's washed for a couple of days in warm water, and then it has a rest period, and then it's dried at the end of the malting period. And during the resting period, any gardeners amongst you, what do you think happens when it's resting? It's been washed and then it's going to sit there and rest. What happens, do you think?
Sprouts.
It does, exactly. It does sprout, yeah. It's just what you would do with seeds if you were going to plant them at home. It starts to swell up and develop starches because we're tricking it. It thinks it's going to grow into this here. But we don't let it. We only let it do that for 4 days and then we dry it. It develops the starch, and we want that starch to make it into sugars to make alcohol. Okay, so that's why it's malted. Now, some places, we don't do this here, some places make what's known as before I say that, I'll tell you this, but any whiskey drinkers amongst you, put your hands up. It's confession time. It's a Sunday, come on. So, do any of the whiskey drinkers amongst you enjoy what we call a peated whiskey? You might know it as a smoky whiskey. Yeah, no. You do, okay. We don't make a peated whiskey here. The region in Scotland for making a peated whiskey is all down the west coast. Did you go to Skye in your tour? No? Well, if you come back to Scotland, go to Skye. It's beautiful. So from Skye all the way down to Islay. Okay, that's the region for making peated whiskies. Here's Blair, Athol here. This is where we're at. And that's Speyside. That's the famous whiskey region. There used to be a lot of farms up there growing grain. And that's why there's now a lot of distilleries. Okay? So to make a peated whiskey, when they're malting the grain at the drying period, at the end of the malting, they light fires under the grain with this here. This is peat, and it's a fuel source in Ireland, Scotland, and some other European countries too. It's turf that's been dug up and dried, and it burns really well in a fire. It doesn't give a great flame, but it does give a good heat. And importantly, for making smoky whiskey, it produces an aromatic smoke. So they light the fires underneath, and the smoke comes up onto the grain and clings onto the grain, and that gets carried right through the whiskey making process. So I'm going to let you smell the difference. This grain here is one that we would use. You have a sniff, sir, and pass it round, thank you. And this second grain, this one's been peated, so you'll know the difference. Okay, it's quite distinctive, so have a sniff. Yeah? You like it? Have you ever tasted a peated whiskey? No?
I'm not sure.
No? You would know. You would know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you would know. We used to malt the grain at the distillery, and there's still 1 or 2 distilleries do the malting in Scotland. This was the loft where they used to spread the grain out for the resting period. Okay? So the grain comes to us ready malted. We've got malting plants around Scotland. Comes like this, and the first thing we do to it, we run it through a mill similar to this one here, and it comes out like this here. It's a coarse barley flour, okay? And you can see the starch at the bottom of the bottle. Do you see it? The white, powdery. It's just a flour you would maybe use to make a peaten loaf or something like that, for a baker at home. So this is what it comes out like once it's been run through the mill. And you can see the starch at the bottom, and that's what we want. We want that starch. So I'm going to give you the measurements now, so get your writing pads out when you're making your whiskey at home. What do you think? That one's quite sweet.
It's very clean.
Yeah, it's a nice sweet smell.
Oh yeah, quite a difference.
That is quite different, isn't it?
Oh, yes. That smells like the peatier whiskeys I've tasted.
Yeah. So we've run the grain through the mill, comes out like this, and we take 8.5 tons, or 8.2 tons of grist. Wow. We call this grist, and we put it into the mash tun over here, and we put in a lot of hot water, 69,000 litres of hot water. And the water goes in over a period, and it starts off at just over 60 degrees centigrade, and it goes up to over 80 degrees centigrade over the time. what happens is it's turning round and round in there. This is like a big porridge pot, really. It's turning, there's blades in there that turn it very, very slowly. And the starch within the grist turns to sugars. Okay, the heat from the water changes it to sugars. So after 6.5 hours in the mash tun, we've got a sweet water known as wort. Okay, so I'd invite you all to go over and have a wee look through the window. There's no mash in it just now. The men start again tonight at 10 o'clock, but you can have a look at the machinery and you'll get an idea of the size of it.
Oh, yeah, it's clean. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for. It's gotta have the yeast in it.
Yeah,
How's everybody gonna know that
I want to
tomorrow?
see this peat. Yeah, I've tasted the smokier whiskeys. I'm not crazy about them. A little bit of smoke's all right, but
Okay, everyone have a look in the mash tun? Yeah, I'll get in there. Okay, so you have to visualise that going round and round, and it's quite slow, and if you put your hand on it, it's quite hot. After 6.5 hours, we've got the sweet water known as wort, and that gets drained from the mash tun. Gets drained from there and goes in pipes under our feet here, along to the next stage where we add the yeast. As it's coming along here, it's too hot to put yeast into, because yeast's a living organism, and if you put it into something that's too hot, it'll kill it straight away. So it goes through a heat exchange with cold water pipes running alongside it to bring it down to the right temperature, which is around 17 degrees centigrade. The mash that's left in the mash tun at the end of the process, we don't waste that. It gets dried and we sell it back to the local farmers for the cattle. All right?
oh,
Yeah, it doesn't get wasted. There's still a lot of nutrition in it. It's sweet. There's no alcohol in it. We've got no drunk cattle in Scotland, but it's nutritious and sweet, and they love it. So that's what happens to the mash. So if you'd like to follow me, I'll show you where fermentation happens.
oh, it's a different smell.
I'll look at the wash bags. One here, these side ones have got paddle switches that you can use. And if you look at this here, that tells you how much liquid's in it. Okay, it's over 5,000 litres. The big the dial up here, it tells you, oh, this one's empty. That's fine.
Yeah.
So this one here, there's a dial there, it tells you how much is in it. You see
Oh,
that?
okay, yeah.
Okay. Everyone will look in
Oh,
the
yeah.
wash bag.
Oh, yeah, you can see it in there. There's a light. That's a light shining
Smell
down in
yeast
there.
in here.
Look in that one. That one's got the.
It starts at 17, it comes in at 17, but the temperature goes up because of the reaction. Okay. So the wort comes along, goes into one of these wash bags, made of stainless steel. They used to be made of wood. Some distilleries still have wooden ones. There's a distillery just 40 minutes up the road of one of theirs are made of wood. Okay, Oregon pine. All right. These get converted quite a while back. They're easier to clean and maintain, and it doesn't influence the flavour at this stage. So it comes in and we fill it up to 37,000 litres, and then we add 170 litres of yeast on top of that. And then it does its thing, you know, it does its thing. The sugar content within the wort and the yeast react and they make beer, okay? And it's in here for 56 hours, so at the end of that time we've got a 9% beer, which is good going. Doesn't look like beer, you'll agree with me, it doesn't look like beer that we would know as beer now. Looks like beer that the Vikings would maybe drink all that long time ago. But at 9% beer is a good start to make whisky with. So from here it goes in pipes down to a holding room called the receiver room, and that's where the liquids are all held there at some point during the process, and that's why it's called the receiver room. 56 hours in here. If I know some of you have visited other distilleries. Every distillery does the same process. There's a mash, then fermentation, and then distillation where it's boiled. Okay. The difference is at each stage we all do something slightly different. I would call it a tweak. Here, 56 hours. Some distilleries have a much longer fermentation. Some of them have 9 days. All right. The first stage, we have 6.5 hours with unpeated grain. Some of them use peated grain, and you'll see variations as we go along, and that's why there's so many different whiskies. There's a saying that there's no such thing as a bad whisky, just some are better than others, okay? And today you're going to taste a good whisky at the end of the tour. Any questions about the mash tuns and the wash bag? Everyone okay so far?
Yes.
Good, okay. Let's go, folks. Nice smell in here.
Ah, it is. Smells almost like bread.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Oh.
Look like big Hershey kisses, don't they? So how many more days have you to go on your tour? Are you going home
Depends.
soon, or are you Tuesday?
Yeah.
And how far north? Have you been to Nairns? That's pretty far north.
Yeah.
And did you go to Loch Ness or?
Loch Ness, yeah.
Excellent. And you've been not too bad with the weather. You've been quite fortunate with
It's
some
been
nice
beautiful.
days.
Today's been the rainiest day.
Yeah. Okay, my friends, so this is the still house. Move forward, folks, and you'll get right in. Thank you. This is the still house, and this is, I like to think this is where the magic happens. The room that we walked through, that's the receiver room. So the beer, or the wash, we call it wash, comes down and goes into the big red tank and the right through there, and it gets held there until we do distillation. Now in Scotland, most distilleries do 2 distillations. They boil the liquid up twice. And distillation is just like putting a kettle on at home and the steam hitting the window and it turns back to liquid again. We're doing that on a much bigger scale. That's what we're doing. And I say most do 2 distillations. There's 1 or 2 that do 3 distillations. In America, for bourbon, how many distillations?
1.
See?
Jason does 3.
Yeah, Ireland. America do 1 and in Ireland they do 3. Scotland 2, okay? And it doesn't mean that anyone doing 3 is better than 1 or 2. It doesn't mean that at all. It just makes a different end product, and we all like different things. We're all different people. So our palates are all different, so it's fine. So here we do 2 distillations. So the operators, we've got 8 men and 1 lady that make the spirit, and we call it spirit. It's not whiskey yet, okay? It's a wee bit away from being whiskey. They bring the beer through, or the wash through, and they do first distillation in these 2 stills here. All right, so it goes into one of these ones, and we boil it up to 98 degrees centigrade, and that's above the boiling point of alcohol, but it's below the boiling point of water. So what happens is the alcohol content turns to steam, to vapour, and the vapour rises up over the swan neck and down the line pipe into the condenser. And the condenser is full of cold water pipes, so it turns it back to liquid again. So after a first boiling, we've got a good jump in the alcohol content. It goes from 9% up to 25%, okay? It's good rise. It's still not good enough to make whiskey with, but it's a good rise. The product that comes out, the 25%, we call that low wines. And as they're made, they go in pipes back through next door into another tank. So then it comes back through the low wines and it goes into one of these 2 stills. And we boil it up again, but this time during the make, we have different strengths of alcohol being produced. And the operators, the men and lady, they do a process that's known as cutting the run. And that means basically the different strengths as they're produced gets cut and sent to different areas through next door so they can separate out the strengths as it's being made. For the first wee while, it's very, very strong. It's about 90% alcohol to volume, too strong to drink. It would make you blind, actually. And that's why going way, way back, when the farmers were drinking their whiskey, it wasn't whiskey like we know nowadays. It wasn't the gold and amber liquid. It was clear, almost kind of more like moonshine. And a lot of them, it was slowly poisoning them. It would make them blind. But if you think about it, life going way back to the 1700s would have been very, very hard. Cold, wet days out in the fields, no help with tractors or anything like that. So if you come in at night, a wee nip of that would make you feel maybe a wee bit better about life in general, I would think. So the strong one we call the head, okay? For the next few hours as it's going along of the boiling, the alcohol content varies between 60 and 70%. It's kind of average 67, and we call that part the heart. And then as the distillation's tailing off, as it's coming to an end, the alcohol content drops back down to 25% again, and that's known as the tail, because it's at the tail end, okay? So as I said, they cut the run, the different strengths as they're being produced. The head and the tail, they get mixed together, and they go back through next door into the tank where the product from first distillation is, where the low wine is, the 25% is, and they get mixed in, all right? And then they come back through again for another distillation. You understand? Yeah? The heart gets cut and put into a separate tank, and that's what we're going to make whiskey with. All right? That's 60 to 70%. That's what we'll make whiskey out of. Now, you're going to ask, how do they do all this cutting and, moving about of the liquids? It's all done from this here. This is known as the spirit safe. If you come right forward, you'll see. In fact, you can come forward, sir. Everyone come forward and you'll see it properly. Everything that's made in the stills runs through the spirit safe. From the first two stills for first distillation, as it's being made, it comes this far. See the far right section here? The bit that's bopped off to the far right? That's for the first two stills. It comes from the pipes at the back, goes into the glass jar, and then goes through next door. All right? For head, heart, and tail, it's the middle section with the 4 jars. So when it's head or tail, you can see that the pipe's pointing to the outer jars. When it changes to heart, the operators come through and they use the brass handles at the top, they swing them round to the centre jars, and that heart goes into a different tank. So it's a way of metering and monitoring everything that's made, all right? They've got glass jars at the front, and they use the handles at the front, or the taps at the front, to put some of the liquid into these so that they can test the strength and the temperature as it's being made. Everything has to be metered and monitored because everything we produce has got no tax applied to it. So everything that's made here is duty free. All right? And anybody want to hazard a guess what duty is, taxes? And I think you're not far behind us. I think it's about 74 or 75 pence in every pound of a bottle of whiskey is tax. Do you know what it is in the States? Anyone know? I think it's, no, you don't know. Okay, it's pretty high, so we're generating a lot of tax here. Okay, now the stills are made of copper, and copper is used for different reasons. The main reason is it's a reactive metal. It works well with spirit. It takes out things like impurities like sulfites that we don't want to be in there. It's a good metal for bending into shape because they're all made by hand. And it's a good metal also for maintaining a regulated heat. All right, there's no variations in the heat. You can control the heat with copper. I think someone's tried to use stainless steel before, but it doesn't quite, you can't control the temperature just as well with stainless steel. So that's why we use copper stills. This is an area where you would see a huge difference in each distillery you visit. I know you're coming back and you're going to do all the distilleries, so you will see a huge difference. We've all got our own individual shapes of stills because the still influences the spirit that's made inside it. Ours are quite straight and we do quite a hard, fast boil. Some of them, at the waistline here, they're pinched right in. Some of them have much longer necks. If you Glenmorangie, they get much taller necks. And some of them in the necks have bubbles. The copper bubbles out. And that's all about keeping the vapour in there for longer. Any questions? Everyone okay?
So these are handmade?
Yeah, they're made not far from here. They last about 50 years, 40 to 50 years.
They have to clean? Do they have to clean?
They don't have to clean those. The washbacks up the stairs get cleaned, but these don't have to get cleaned because it's such a high temperature, inside, so they don't have to clean them. Okay, folks, if you'd like to follow me downstairs, just watch yourselves as you come down. Jennifer.
Enduring.
Step there, ma'am. See what she steps there. Yeah, I love the lining of the jacket. It's gorgeous. Thank you. It's nice. Yes. Watch the step there, sir. Yeah, just starting to. Yeah, we wouldn't stand for too long here. Just mind the step there, sir. A small step there. Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Maria leaves us now. Bye-bye, Maria. So the part of the tour that you've seen, that's the shortest part of making whiskey. The longest part is leaving it in the barrel to mature. Okay? That's probably about 4 or 5 days from the mash being made to the spirit running through the spirit safe. And as it's running through there, it's known as new make spirit. And the smell up in the still house when that's running, it's a heady smell. It's almost like overripe bananas. It's a lovely smell. When the stills are on in there, it can go over 45 degrees centigrade, so it's very, very hot. Okay, and you can't stand in there for any length of time. So that's the shortest part of making whiskey. There are laws that apply to making whiskey. The first law is it has to be in an oak cask for 3 years and 1 day. Okay, minimum of 3 years and 1 day. You're going to say, why the 1 day? I think at some point, going way back in time, somebody was trying to break into a barrel at midnight on the third year, you know, the end of the third year, so they put another day on it. It has always to be matured in an oak barrel, the wood oak, all right, always. And it has to be 40% alcohol or stronger. You would call that 80 proof or stronger. It can't be any weaker than that to qualify as whiskey. All right, so we'll head down round this way. We won't stand in the rain for too long. Although it's not rain, it's just unmade whiskey.
Oh, that's beautiful. It's nice.
So everyone, this is the Alp Dower, this is the river of the Otter, or the burn of the Otter, and this is where all the water comes from for making the whiskey. All comes from here. If you visit any other distillery, they're always sited beside a good and pure water source, and this is ours. It comes from a mountain, comes from a mountain above the town known as Benbaraki, and comes down over untreated ground and down here, and we pull it through the 2 silver plates over there. In a normal working day, we use about 150,000 litres of water, so we use a lot of water. So we'll go this way. I can see where the whiskey sleeps. This way, Mum. Okay.
Mm-hmm. 2012. Holy smokes.
What, holy smokes?
You see, those were 2000 up there. You see 2012.
Oh.
They're aging quite a while.
Yes, they are.
Shut this through, but before she passes. Okay. Thank you. Okay, everybody, so as I said, the spirit gets matured in oak barrels, and this is one of our warehouses where it sleeps. We call it sleeping because when whiskey's maturing, it doesn't need to be moved. Wine making, you have to rotate the barrels because of the sediment in the barrels. Whiskey, there's no sediment, so it comes here and it rests or sleeps. Okay. The warehouse isn't heated and it's not air conditioned. It's at the same temperature that we're at. Whiskey likes to be made in a cold climate, so that's why there's a lot of whiskey in Scotland. So we've got 5,000 barrels here, and we have another 2 warehouses on site also containing 5,000 barrels. And as the spirit lies in the cask and matures, and we lose an amount through evaporation every year. It evaporates out through the wood. And at this distillery, it's 2% per year
That
of
barrel
the
down there
reducing
says
volume that we
1968.
use. Okay, so it
You were
evaporates
a
out and
child.
goes up to heaven, and that's why it's known as the angel's share. Okay? If you're looking for an angel in Scotland, they're all above distilleries having a party. So, whisky can be matured in different types of barrels. And whatever you put the clear spirit into, whatever type of barrel, the spirit goes into the wood and seeps into the wood and pulls out the flavour from the previous contents and the wood. All right, so here we use two different types of barrels, old barrels. We use bourbon barrels from America, and we use sherry barrels from the north of Spain. You know the drink sherry? We use some of them too. And that's what we mature the whisky in here. Some distilleries use port, Madeira, rum, wine, and whatever you put it into, it pulls out the flavour and it changes the end flavour and colour and character of the spirit. Okay, just to let you know. So, a lot of distilleries use bourbon barrels because there's a never-ending supply of bourbon barrels. Those of you that have been to some of the bourbon houses will know this probably, but there's a never-ending supply of bourbon barrels because when the bourbon's taken out of a bourbon barrel, they're not allowed to reuse that barrel. They can't fill it up again and let it mature again. The barrel has to go away. There was a law brought in the States after Prohibition. All right, Prohibition finished in 1933. If you jump to 1935, the coopers, men that make the barrels, their union got together and they managed to get a law put through the government to say the barrel should only be used once. And that was their way of guaranteeing, they were savvy, that was their way of guaranteeing work for themselves. They've been out of work for 13 years. Themselves, the lumber, they would all be out of work for a long time, 13 years. So they didn't want to be out of work again. And it's a law that's still in place just now. So when the bourbon's taken out, the barrels are taken to pieces into staves, like the long parts, and they come here or wherever they're going, and our coopers build them back up again. So thank you for your lovely barrels because it makes a nice whisky. And there's also a big cost implication. A bourbon barrel is just shy of £100 to purchase. A sherry barrel is quite a lot more expensive. They're about £1,000. So a big cost difference. Yeah. But a lot of distilleries use bourbon barrels and it makes a lovely whisky, So, if you're buying a whisky, whisky once it's into the bottle doesn't mature anymore, all right? So let's say 10 years ago you bought a 10-year-old whisky or a 12-year-old whisky. Today it's not a 20-year-old whisky or a 22-year-old whisky, it's still a 10-year-old whisky, all right? It doesn't keep maturing. Wine, once it goes into the bottle, can mature and change quite a lot. Whisky doesn't, all right? Also, I'm not advocating that you drink a lot. Everything's like life, everything. The older you get, the wiser you get. I think. Well, I'm hoping. everything in moderation. Okay, but if you've opened a bottle of whiskey and it's a nice one, a good one, or you particularly enjoy it, don't leave it for too long before you finish it, because once air gets into the bottle, it starts to change. All right, so don't keep it much past 2.5 years. All right, I had a lady in once that she said, "Oh, I've got a lot of nice bottles, Jennifer. I've opened them and I've got 50. It's been open for 15 years or 20, and they will change. They change because air gets into it and it starts to make it syrupy and the flavour changes. So don't keep it for too long. Okay. Any questions about the warehouse? No? All okay. Whiskey's been made all around the world. Everywhere's making whiskey. Germany, Japan, Korea, all different places. The hotter and more humid the country that's making the whiskey, the more they'll lose to the angels. It creates bigger evaporation, all right, which makes sense if you think about it. It causes more evaporation. Some of them can lose 10% per year of the reducing volume, okay, so you can lose a lot more. And I know in some of the bourbon houses they have to bring the top barrels down to the bottom, rotate them down because of the heat. Here, you can tell we don't have that problem here, so we don't need to bring ours down to the bottom, they just rest. Has anyone spotted our oldest barrel? Yeah. You see it at the front?
68.
Yeah, so that's a 51-year-old whisky. And the Angels have had a good share out of that barrel. There's probably about 50 or 60 litres left in that because it's been sitting for as long. Some of that one's been selected to go into a Johnny Walker celebratory bottle for next year. They're going to be 200 years old next year. So they're creating a special, I think it's about 3 or 4 different 50-year-old whiskies. It's going into a specially created bottle for next year. Okay, so if you'd all like to follow me out this top door, as you walk past here, you can see the Angel's Share, and you can see New Make Spirit, the clear spirit running through the Spirit Safe. 4 years, 8 years and 12 years, how it matures in colour and character lying in the barrel. Okay, yes?
The barrels on top with the red.
There's no distinction between them, they've just been painted red here.
Okay.
Most of the barrels, you'll notice, have all got barcodes on them, and that's how they track them. We're all on computers somewhere, aren't we? I know. So these are all tracked with barcodes. So if you'd like to follow me now, we'll go and taste some of their 12-year-olds. Okay? Applied to it. Okay? You can come at any point. Okay, everyone. It just gets less and less every year. It's like how long it things. You know, the oldest one we've got in the bar, we've got a 57-year-old. It's not ours, it's another whiskey. It's a 40-year-old. Is everybody in 50-year-old?
Keep walking from one tree to the next.
Do what?
I said, now I want to see the water trees.
Yeah.
No, I know that whiskey trees in Ireland, when the nuts came from Ireland to Scotland, they brought religion and they got whiskey. So they brought it from Ireland.